The morning of October 25, 1944, broke clear over the Philippine Sea. Aboard the USS Lexington, Lieutenant Commander Andrew Ham watched as deck crews wheeled his Curtiss SB2C Helldiver toward the catapult. The beast weighed nearly 17,000 pounds, fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and a 1,000-pound bomb nestled in its internal bay. Behind him in the rear cockpit, his radioman gunner, Aviation Radioman Second Class, checked the twin 30-caliber machine guns one final time. They were going hunting. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 250 miles to the northwest, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force steamed south from Japan knowing they were bait. His 4 aircraft carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, carried only 116 aircraft between them, barely enough to mount a credible combat air patrol, let alone strike American ships. But that wasn't the point. The carriers existed that morning for one purpose: to die while drawing Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf, where Japanese battleships would slip through and destroy the American invasion force. Ozawa's mission was suicide with a strategic objective. What he didn't anticipate was the manner of his fleet's destruction, or that American dive bomber pilots would subject themselves to physical forces that would leave them temporarily blind, all to ensure their bombs found their marks. The SB2C Helldiver was never supposed to be controversial. When Curtiss Wright began development in 1938, the Navy's requirements seemed straightforward. Build a dive bomber to replace the Douglas SBD Dauntless, make it faster, give it longer range, provide an internal bomb bay for reduced drag, and ensure it could carry a 1,000-pound bomb or a torpedo. The catch, as always, in with carrier aviation, was size. 2 Helldivers had to fit side by side on the 40-foot by 48-foot elevators planned for the new Essex-class carriers. This demanded a short coupled airframe, one where the distance from wing to tail was unusually brief, a design choice that would haunt the aircraft through years of troubled development. Engineer Raymond C. Blaylock led the design team, attempting to overcome the instability inherent in short-coupled airframes through sheer brute force. The Helldiver received enormous tail surfaces, massive vertical and horizontal stabilizers that gave it a distinctive profile pilots would come to know as the big-tailed beast. The Wright R2-60020 Cyclone engine, a 14-cylinder radial producing 1,900 horsepower at takeoff, drove a 13-foot propeller. Everything about the design screamed power and capacity, but early testing revealed an aircraft that was difficult to fly, unstable in certain configurations, and prone to maintenance nightmares that drove carrier crews to distraction. The Truman Committee investigated the troubled program in 1942. Their report was scathing. Production delays, design changes during manufacturing, structural failures during testing, all contributed to an aircraft that should have entered service in early 1942 but didn't reach combat squadrons until November 11, 1943, when Bombing Squadron 17 attacked the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. By then, the SBD Dauntless had already achieved legendary status at Midway and Guadalcanal. Pilots transitioning from the reliable, predictable Dauntless to the temperamental Helldiver earned the aircraft its other famous nickname, Son of a Bitch, Second Class. But nicknames aside, by October 1944, the Helldiver had matured into something formidable. The -3 and -4 variants incorporated lessons from 2 years of combat modifications. Perforated dive brakes solved the high-speed buffeting problems that had plagued earlier models. The heavier airframe, initially criticized as sluggish, proved capable of absorbing tremendous battle damage, and that massive engine gave the Helldiver performance the Dauntless couldn't match. Maximum level speed reached 294 miles per hour at 12,400 feet. In a steep dive with brakes deployed, Helldivers held steady at 350 to 400 miles per hour, the dive brakes preventing the dangerous compressibility effects that could make control surfaces useless as airflow approached the speed of sound. The technique of dive bombing had reached its peak refinement by late 1944. Pilots approached their targets at 10,000 to 15,000 feet, beyond the reach of most anti-aircraft fire. At the proper moment, they would roll inverted and pull through into a 70 to 78-degree dive, nearly vertical. The Helldivers' nose would point directly at the target, transforming the complex problem of bomb trajectory into simple direct line geometry. The pilot aimed by looking over the nose, using the Mark 8 reflector gun sight to place an illuminated reticle directly on the target. Wind, ship movement, the bomb's ballistic characteristics, all could be compensated for by minor adjustments during the dive itself. The critical moment came at bomb release altitude, typically between 1,500 and 3,000 feet, depending on anti-aircraft defenses and pilot aggression. Release the bomb, then immediately begin the pullout. This was where physics became personal. A Helldiver diving at 70 degrees at 350 miles per hour carries enormous kinetic energy. Converting that downward velocity into level flight or a climb requires tremendous force applied over a short distance. The pilot would haul back on the control stick, pulling the aircraft through an arc that subjected both plane and pilot to forces measured in multiples of Earth's gravity. Standard doctrine called for a 4 to 6 G pullout. At 4 Gs, a 200-pound pilot effectively weighs 800 pounds. Blood drains from the brain toward the feet. Vision begins to grey at the edges. At 6 Gs, that same pilot weighs 1,200 pounds, and maintaining consciousness requires conscious effort, tensing leg and abdominal muscles to prevent blood from pooling in the lower body. The Ju-87 Stuka, Germany's famous dive bomber, had incorporated an automatic 6G pullout system specifically because pilots were blacking out during manual recoveries. But 6Gs assumed reasonable risk tolerance and conventional tactical thinking. By October 1944, American dive bomber pilots facing Japanese fleet anti-aircraft fire had learned to be more aggressive. Lieutenant Norman "Dusty" Kleiss, an SBD Dauntless ace from Midway, had documented in his combat reports using 7, 8, and even 9G pullouts when pressing attacks against heavily defended targets. At 9Gs, that 200-pound pilot weighs 1,800 pounds. His arms weigh 180 pounds. His head weighs 90 pounds. Vision doesn't grey, it goes completely black as blood pressure in the brain drops below the threshold necessary to maintain consciousness. The blackout typically lasts only a few seconds, vision returning as the G-forces decrease and blood flow normalizes. But those seconds occur at low altitude, with the aircraft still recovering from the dive, making the technique extraordinarily dangerous, even as it drastically reduced exposure to anti-aircraft fire. The perforated dive brakes on the Helldiver's wings were marvels of aerodynamic engineering. When deployed, they extended perpendicular to the airflow, creating massive drag that limited terminal velocity to a controllable speed. Without them, a Helldiver in a 75-degree dive would accelerate past 400 miles per hour, approaching speeds where control surfaces became ineffective and structural failure became probable. With dive brakes deployed, the pilot could maintain a steady dive angle and speed, making precise aim possible. They retracted slowly, so standard procedure was to hit the retraction switch at bomb release, allowing them to fold back during the pullout, reducing drag as the pilot converted speed into altitude. The armament carried by each Helldiver reflected American industrial philosophy. Two 20mm cannons, one in each wing, provided forward-firing capability with 400 rounds per gun. These weren't the rifle-caliber machine guns that had equipped earlier dive bombers. 20mm shells could shred aircraft, destroy light vehicles, and suppress anti-aircraft positions during the dive. In the rear cockpit, the radioman gunner controlled twin 30-caliber machine guns on a flexible mounting, providing defensive fire against pursuing fighters. The total weight of armament, ammunition, armor plate behind both crew members, self-sealing fuel tanks with 212 pounds of protective rubber coating, all of it added up. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A fully loaded Helldiver weighed nearly 17,000 pounds, almost double the weight of a Japanese Zero fighter. Japanese naval aviators, by October 1944, had been fighting a losing battle against American material superiority for more than 2 years. The Mitsubishi A6M0 that had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and 42 now flew against opponents it couldn't match. The F-6F Hellcat had established absolute air superiority through superior vertical performance and overwhelming numbers, but fighters, however effective, couldn't sink battleships or carriers by themselves. That mission belonged to dive bombers and torpedo bombers, and by late 1944, the Helldiver had become the primary American dive bomber in the Pacific Fleet. Approximately 30 Navy squadrons operated Helldivers from 13 fleet carriers by October 1944. The aircraft-equipped bombing squadrons aboard Essex, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Franklin, Intrepid, and every other major carrier in Task Force 38. They had proven themselves in the Marianas, where Helldivers had helped sink Japanese carriers during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June. They had struck Japanese installations throughout the Western Pacific, from Palau to Formosa, and now they were about to participate in the largest naval battle in history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf began on October 20, 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte Island and announced to the Filipino people that he had returned. The amphibious landing was the largest operation in the Pacific War to that point, involving more than 700 ships under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet, built around Task Force 38 with 15 fleet carriers, provided air cover and protection against the Japanese Navy. Japanese commanders understood the stakes perfectly. If the Philippines fell, Japan's empire would be cut in half. The oil from Borneo and Southeast Asia that kept the Navy and Air Force operating would become inaccessible. The war would effectively be lost. So the Imperial Japanese Navy activated Shogo 1, a desperate plan that risked virtually every remaining major surface combatant in a coordinated attack designed to destroy the American invasion fleet. The plan was elegant and complex. Vice Admiral Ozawa would bring his northern force, built around 4 aircraft carriers, down from Japan. The carriers were hollow shells, carrying barely enough aircraft to mount token resistance. Their true purpose was to act as bait, drawing Halsey's powerful carrier task force away from Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force would approach through the San Bernardino Strait with 5 battleships, including the Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever built. A southern force under Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura would push through Surigao Strait. Both battleship forces would converge on the American invasion fleet at dawn on October 25, catching the amphibious ships and transports in a devastating surface engagement. For the plan to work, Ozawa had to attract Halsey's attention and hold it long enough for the battleships to reach Leyte Gulf. He succeeded brilliantly, perhaps too brilliantly. On October 24, American submarines ambushed Kurita's center force in Palawan Passage, sinking 2 heavy cruisers, including Kurita's flagship. Later that day, wave after wave of American carrier aircraft attacked Kurita's force as it transited the Sibuyan Sea. The battleship Musashi, struck by approximately 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, rolled over and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. Kurita briefly turned back, appearing to retreat. Halsey, receiving reports that Kurita had been badly damaged and was retiring, turned his attention to the newly discovered northern force. Here were Japanese carriers, the prize target for any American admiral. His orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz were somewhat ambiguous. They emphasized both protecting the Leyte landings and destroying the Japanese fleet if the opportunity arose. Halsey interpreted this as permission to pursue Ozawa with his entire fleet, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. It was a decision that would spark controversy for decades, but at the time, it seemed the Japanese carriers posed the greater threat. Throughout October 24th and into the evening, American search planes tracked Ozawa's northern force as it steamed south along the east coast of Luzon. Ozawa, desperate to be noticed, had even launched airstrikes against Task Force 38, sacrificing his limited aircraft in attacks that accomplished little beyond announcing his presence. By 2300 hours on October 24th, Halsey had committed. Task Force 38, all 15 carriers, 6 fast battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, turned north in pursuit of the Japanese carriers. The stage was set for the morning of October 25th. To the south, Kurita's battleships would emerge from San Bernardino Strait and stumble into a desperate engagement with escort carriers off Samar, the battle off Samar that would become legendary for the courage of destroyers attacking battleships. But to the north, approximately 400 miles off Cape Engaño at the northeastern tip of Luzon, American carrier aircraft were about to demonstrate dive bombing as it had evolved into its most lethal form. The first American searches detected Ozawa's carriers at 0 to 200 hours on October 25th. By 0 to 400, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 38 from Lexington, ordered his carriers to arm aircraft and prepare for strikes. The target was clear, 4 Japanese carriers steaming in formation with minimal air cover. Every bomber pilot in the task force understood what was about to happen. This was the opportunity they had trained for. Enemy carriers caught at sea with nowhere to hide. The launch began at 0 to 600 hours on October 25th. From the decks of Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, Franklin, and the other carriers of Task Force 38, Helldivers roared into the pre-dawn darkness, followed by Avenger torpedo bombers and Hellcat fighters. The strike groups formed up by division, circling their carriers as the sky gradually brightened. Lieutenant Commander Richard Kibbe from Franklin led one formation. Commander Hugh Winters from Lexington led another. Each strike coordinator knew his target assignment. The 4 Japanese carriers would be hit by coordinated waves, dive bombers from altitude, torpedo bombers low on the water, all timed to overwhelm the defenders. The flight north took approximately 1 hour. As the sun rose over the Philippine Sea, American pilots could see the Japanese formation clearly. Ozawa's carriers steamed in a loose diamond pattern, with the fleet carrier Zuikaku at the center. She was the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Around her sailed the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, smaller vessels converted from submarine tenders and seaplane carriers. The 2 battleships, Issei and Hyuga, their rear turrets removed and replaced with short flight decks in a hybrid design, provided anti-aircraft support. 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers completed the formation. What struck American pilots immediately was the absence of Japanese combat air patrol. A handful of fighters circled the fleet, but nothing like the dense defensive screens that had protected Japanese carriers earlier in the war. Japan's pilot training program had collapsed under the weight of attrition. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, the men who had learned to fly over China and practiced their skills through years of peacetime training, were dead. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training programs with as little as 100 flight hours total, could barely keep their aircraft in formation, let alone contest American air superiority. The first American strike arrived over the Japanese fleet at approximately 0 to 800 hours. Strike coordinator gave the order to begin attack runs. Hellcat fighters swept down first, strafing anti-aircraft positions and suppressing defensive fire. Then the Helldivers pushed over into their dives. Lieutenant Howard Skidmore from the Lexington rolled his Helldiver inverted and pulled through, pointing his nose at the Zuikaku far below. The angle was 75 degrees, nearly vertical. His dive brakes deployed with a solid thunk, creating tremendous drag that held his airspeed to 360 miles per hour. Through his reflector sight, he could see the carrier attempting evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port. But in a near-vertical dive, the pilot sees everything. He simply adjusted his aim, keeping the reticle on the target. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the Japanese fleet. Zuikaku mounted dozens of 25mm Type 96 guns, backed by larger 5-inch weapons. Black puffs of exploding shells appeared around Skidmore's aircraft, but the steep dive made tracking difficult. Japanese gunners had to estimate a rapidly changing range, while the target presented a small frontal silhouette. Red tracer rounds from lighter automatic weapons arced upward, looking almost lazy until you realized they were traveling at thousands of feet per second. At 2,000 feet, Skidmore released his 1,000-pound bomb. Then he did something that standard doctrine discouraged. Instead of a controlled 4G pullout that would have him leveling off around 1,000 feet, he hauled back on the stick with maximum force. The Helldiver's massive tail surfaces bit into the airstream. The aircraft's nose came up violently, pulling through an arc that subjected Skidmore to forces approaching 8 Gs. At 8 Gs, Skidmore weighed 1,600 pounds. His flight suit, normally weighing perhaps 2 pounds, felt like it weighed 16. His arms felt like they were made of lead. Most critically, blood drained from his brain toward his feet at a rate his cardiovascular system couldn't compensate for. His vision grayed at the edges first, a phenomenon pilots called grayout. Then the grey expanded inward until he was looking through a tunnel. Then the tunnel closed completely, and everything went black. The blackout lasted perhaps 3 seconds. When Skidmore's vision returned, his Helldiver was climbing away from the Japanese fleet at full throttle, already at 1,500 feet, and accelerating. Behind him, his 1,000-pound bomb had struck Zuikaku's flight deck near the island superstructure, penetrating through to the hangar deck before exploding. The detonation ignited aviation gasoline and ammunition, starting fires that damage control parties would fight for hours. Wave after wave of Helldivers followed Skidmore's pattern. The technique had become standard among experienced pilots attacking heavily defended targets. Dive steep, aim precisely, release low, then pull out with maximum G-force to minimize time in the anti-aircraft kill zone. The lower the release altitude, the more accurate the bombing, but also the more violent the pull-out required to avoid flying into the water or pulling the wings off the aircraft. Ensign Raymond Meyer from the Bennington's Bombing Squadron 1 described the experience in his post-action report. The dive is controlled terror. You're pointed straight down at a ship throwing everything it has at you. You know that if you flinch, if you pull out early, your bomb misses and you've wasted the mission. So you hold the dive. You watch the target getting larger in your sight. You can see individual gun mounts firing. You can see people on the deck. Then you release and pull. The G-forces hit you like a truck. Your vision tunnels, then goes black. You come to a few seconds later, and you're climbing away, and you don't remember the pull-out at all. The physical toll was cumulative. Pilots flying multiple strikes in a single day, 2 or 3 missions, experienced repeated exposure to extreme G-forces. Some developed burst blood vessels in their eyes, tiny red spots from ruptured capillaries. Others suffered crushing headaches that lasted for hours after landing. The human body wasn't designed to experience 8 or 9 times its normal weight repeatedly, yet dive bomber pilots subjected themselves to exactly that, because it increased their survival rate against heavy anti-aircraft fire. Japanese observers aboard the carriers watched the American attacks with a mixture of professional respect and growing horror. Ensign Shinji Hayakawa, stationed aboard the Musashi during the Sibuyan Sea battle the previous day, had survived that ship's sinking and been rescued. He was now aboard one of the destroyers screening Ozawa's carriers. In his post-war testimony, translated by American intelligence officers, he described the morning of October 25th. The American planes came at dawn, so many of them. They attacked from high altitude, diving almost vertically. Our anti-aircraft fire seemed to have no effect. The bombers would dive through the shells, release their bombs very low, then pull up so violently that I thought they must break apart. But they didn't break. They climbed away and the bombs struck our carriers. I counted perhaps 30 or 40 dive bombers in the first wave alone. How could we survive such an attack? The Zuikaku, despite her damage, continued fighting for hours. Her crew, among the most, experienced in the Imperial Japanese Navy, executed damage control procedures with precision. They flooded magazines to prevent explosions, fought fires with every available hand, and maintained power to the ship's engines. But the attacks continued. A second wave arrived at 1000 hours. A third came at 1 to 300. Each brought more bombs, more fires, more damage. The light carrier Zuiho died first. Smaller than Zuikaku, with lighter construction and fewer damage control resources, she couldn't survive the repeated hits. Lieutenant Commander James Minnie from the Enterprise led a coordinated strike that placed 3 bombs directly on her flight deck in rapid succession. The explosions gutted her hangar deck and ruptured her aviation gasoline storage tanks. Fires spread out of control. By 1100 hours, her captain gave the order to abandon ship. She rolled over and sank at approximately 1300 hours, taking more than 200 men with her. Chitose and Chiyoda, the converted seaplane carriers, fared no better. Their light construction, designed for carrying reconnaissance floatplanes, couldn't withstand the 1,000-pound bombs that American Helldivers delivered with brutal precision. Chitose took multiple hits that flooded her engine rooms and left her dead in the water. American cruisers and destroyers finished her with gunfire later in the afternoon. Chiyoda survived until late afternoon, when she was finally sunk by surface action after being left crippled and burning. The Zuikaku fought on alone. By early afternoon, she had absorbed perhaps 10 or more direct bomb hits and several near misses that opened seams in her hull plating below the waterline. Fires raged throughout her hangar deck and several engineering spaces. Her list increased steadily as flooding overwhelmed counterflooding efforts. The carrier that had launched planes against Pearl Harbor, that had fought at Coral Sea and the Philippine Sea, that represented the last operational fleet carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, was dying. Captain Toshio Kaizuka, commanding Zuikaku, made the decision to abandon ship at approximately 1400 hours. Destroyers came alongside to take off survivors, while dive bombers continued to circle overhead, waiting for permission to strike again. The Americans held fire while the evacuation proceeded, a gesture of professional respect between warriors. When the last men had been taken off, Zuikaku settled lower in the water. Her bow rose as flooding progressed aft. At approximately 1414 hours, she rolled to port and slipped beneath the waves. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived. His flag had been transferred to the light cruiser Oyodo after Zuikaku became untenable. He watched his carriers die, knowing he had accomplished his mission. Halsey's Third Fleet had been drawn north, away from Leyte Gulf. The battleships under Kurita should have reached the American invasion force and destroyed it. But Ozawa didn't know that Kurita, after a confused engagement with American escort carriers off Samar, had turned back without reaching the main invasion fleet. The sacrifice of the northern force had been for nothing. The battle off Cape Engaño cost Japan 4 aircraft carriers, 1 light cruiser, and 2 destroyers, along with hundreds of trained sailors and officers it couldn't replace. Task Force 38 lost no ships. Several aircraft were shot down, but most pilots were rescued by submarines on lifeguard duty. The kill ratio told the story. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers had destroyed an entire carrier force in a single day while suffering minimal losses. But the real story wasn't just about ships sunk or battles won. It was about what those attacks revealed regarding the evolution of naval aviation and the physical limits American pilots were willing to endure to accomplish their missions. The 7 to 9G pullouts that Helldiver pilots routinely performed over Cape Engaño represented the absolute edge of human capability in World War II-era aircraft. Modern fighter pilots wear G-suits, specially designed garments that use inflatable bladders to squeeze blood from the legs and abdomen back toward the brain during high-G maneuvers. World War II dive bomber pilots had nothing but their own muscle tension and willpower. The technique worked because of training and selection. Navy pilot training in 1944 was extraordinarily rigorous. Candidates underwent extensive physical testing, including exposure to high-G environments in human centrifuges that spun them at increasing rates while monitoring their physiological responses. Those who blacked out too easily or couldn't maintain consciousness above 5Gs were eliminated from dive bomber training. The men who made it through knew their limits and how to push right up against them without exceeding the point where loss of consciousness would cause them to crash. The Helldiver itself enabled these extreme pullouts through robust construction. Engineers at Curtiss-Wright had designed the airframe to withstand forces that would tear apart lighter aircraft. The wings attached to a massive center section that passed through the fuselage as a single continuous structure, distributing loads across the entire span rather than concentrating stress at attachment points. The fuselage used heavy-gauge aluminum with substantial internal framing. Multiple load paths meant that even if one structural member failed, others could carry the stress. Japanese dive bomber doctrine, by contrast, emphasized different priorities. The Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei dive bomber, which saw limited action at Leyte Gulf, could reach speeds of 360 miles per hour in level flight and dive at angles comparable to American aircraft. But it lacked the structural strength to routinely withstand 8 or 9G pullouts. Japanese pilots were trained to use more moderate 4 to 5G recoveries, which meant either releasing bombs at higher altitude with reduced accuracy or accepting longer exposure to anti-aircraft fire during shallower pullout profiles. Either choice reduced combat effectiveness. The American advantage came from systems integration. The Helldiver's airframe strength enabled extreme pullouts. The dive brakes allowed controlled, precise dives. The armament provided effective suppression of anti-aircraft positions. The armor and self-sealing fuel tanks gave pilots confidence to press attacks, and the training produced pilots who understood how to extract maximum performance from their aircraft, even when it meant temporary unconsciousness during the pullout. All of these elements working together created a weapons system that was greater than the sum of its parts. The strategic implications of Cape Engaño extended far beyond the immediate battle. Japan's carrier aviation, which had begun the Pacific War with the finest naval aviators in the world, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force on October 25, 1944. The 4 carriers sunk that day represented more than just ships. They embodied Japan's inability to rebuild what had been lost at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and countless smaller engagements. The pilots were gone. The carriers were gone. The industrial capacity to replace either was gone. American carrier aviation, by contrast, was reaching peak capability. The 15 carriers of Task Force 38 represented just a fraction of American naval air power. More Essex-class carriers were completing their shakedown cruises and preparing to join the fleet. Training pipelines were producing dive bomber pilots faster than combat consumed them. Industrial production meant that every Helldiver lost in action was replaced within days. The asymmetry was crushing. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, as a whole, encompassing the 4 separate engagements at Palawan Passage, the Sibuyan Sea, Surigao, Strait, and Cape Engaño, destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy as a strategic force. Japan would continue fighting for another 10 months, but it would do so without meaningful naval support. The desperate kamikaze tactics that emerged during Leyte Gulf, with pilots deliberately crashing bomb-laden aircraft into American ships, reflected a military establishment that had run out of conventional options. For the Helldiver, Cape Engaño represented vindication. The aircraft that had entered service amid controversy and complaints had proven itself in the largest naval battle in history. During the Sibuyan Sea engagement on October 24th, Helldivers had helped sink the Musashi, the largest battleship ever built. The following day, they destroyed 4 carriers in coordinated strikes that showcased American tactical aviation at its most lethal. The son of a bitch second class had become one of the war's most effective ship killers. Production continued at high rates through 1945. Curtiss delivered SB2C4 and SB2C5 variants, with improved engines, better armor, and underwing rocket rails. By war's end, more than 7,000 Helldivers had been built. They participated in strikes against Japanese positions throughout the Western Pacific, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa to the Japanese home islands. During the final months of the war, Helldivers attacked the remnants of the Japanese fleet in harbor at Kure, sinking or damaging every remaining major warship. The human cost of these missions remained high even when ship losses were minimal. The repeated exposure to extreme G-forces took a cumulative toll. Some pilots developed chronic back problems from compression injuries to their spines. Others suffered vision problems from repeated blackouts. The psychological stress of diving repeatedly through heavy anti-aircraft fire, knowing that each mission required you to push your aircraft and your body to the absolute limit, produced what we would now recognize as combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress. Aviation Radio Man Second Class Gerald Westwater, flying rear seat in Ensign Meyer's Helldiver during strikes against Japan in July 1945, described a mission where their aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire at the moment of bomb release. The explosion flipped the Helldiver onto its back. Meyer regained control and executed a pullout that reached speeds of 420 knots, far beyond the aircraft's normal limitations. Westwater, in his post-mission report, admitted that panic and terror had overwhelmed him during those seconds. The fear of dying in a burning aircraft, the violent G-forces of the pullout, the uncertainty of whether the damaged plane would hold together, all combined to produce a psychological experience that would haunt him for years. Yet he flew again the next day. They all did. That was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of dive bomber operations in the Pacific War. Pilots and aircrew knew the risks. They knew that each mission required them to fly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire, dive while tracers arced past their canopies, pull out with forces that induced temporary blindness, and do it all over again hours later if tasked. They did it anyway because the mission demanded it, and because their training had prepared them to function effectively, even in extremis. The dive bomber as a distinct aircraft type didn't survive long after World War II ended. The Helldiver remained in service with the U.S. Navy until 1949, replaced by the Douglas AD Skyraider. But the Skyraider wasn't really a dive bomber in the traditional sense. It was a multi-role attack aircraft capable of carrying enormous ordnance loads for ground support missions. The specialized dive bomber, designed around a single mission profile of approaching at altitude and diving nearly vertically onto ships, had become obsolete. Several factors drove this obsolescence. Radar-directed, anti-aircraft fire became far more accurate after the war, making the predictable dive profile more dangerous. Air-to-ground rockets provided precision strike capability without requiring aircraft to dive through the target's defensive envelope. Most significantly, jet propulsion changed the calculus. Jets could deliver ordnance at high speeds and low altitudes, then use their power to escape before defenses could react effectively. But for the brief period from 1943 to 1945, the SB2C Helldiver represented the pinnacle of dive bomber development. It combined power, structural strength, precision, and capability in ways that enabled American pilots to sink more enemy tonnage than any other aircraft type in the Pacific War. The 7G dives over Cape Engaño demonstrated what could be accomplished when skilled pilots flew robust aircraft and accepted extreme physical stress as the price of mission success. Japanese survivors of Cape Engaño, interviewed after the war, consistently mentioned the American dive bombers' apparent fearlessness. They described aircraft that dove through anti-aircraft fire that should have been prohibitive, released bombs at altitudes that seemed suicidal, then pulled out in maneuvers that looked like they should tear the wings off. What the Japanese observers were seeing was the result of systematic American advantages in training, engineering, and doctrine, all focused on a single objective: destroying enemy ships, regardless of the cost. That cost was measured not just in aircraft lost or pilots killed, but in the physical toll extracted from every man who flew these missions. The temporary blindness during high-G pullouts, the crushing headaches, the cumulative damage to spines and cardiovascular systems. These were the hidden prices of victory. The men who paid those prices rarely discussed them. They were doing their jobs. The fact that their jobs required them to routinely subject themselves to forces at the edge of human tolerance was simply accepted as part of dive bombing. The legacy of Cape Engaño and the other dive bomber missions of World War II extends into modern naval aviation. Current carrier-based strike aircraft, like the F/A-18 Super Hornet, use different tactics, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Precision delivery of ordnance against defended targets requires pilots willing to put themselves at risk. The specific techniques have evolved with technology, but the requirement for courage, skill, and acceptance of physical stress continues. The SB2C Helldiver sank its last enemy ship in August 1945 during strikes against Japanese positions in the final days before surrender. When Japan capitulated on September 2nd, Helldivers remained in service with dozens of squadrons across the Pacific. Some continued flying during the occupation of Japan, others returned to the United States aboard carriers that had spent years at war. A few remained in service with reserve squadrons until the late 1940s. Today, only a handful of Helldivers survive. Most were scrapped after the war, their aluminum melted down and repurposed for peacetime use. The few examples in museums stand as monuments to a very specific moment in aviation history, when the dive bomber represented the most effective means of sinking ships, and when pilots routinely subjected themselves to forces that induced temporary unconsciousness to accomplish their missions. The morning of October 25, 1944, over Cape Engaño, demonstrated what American naval aviation had become by the final year of the Pacific War. It wasn't just about superior numbers or better aircraft, though both mattered. It was about pilots willing to push themselves and their aircraft to absolute limits. It was about 7 and 8 and 9G pullouts that left men blind for crucial seconds. It was about bomb runs that required holding the dive until anti-aircraft fire was so close you could see individual shell bursts. It was about coming back and doing it again hours later because the mission demanded it. Japanese carriers burned and sank that day because American dive bomber pilots flew aircraft designed to withstand the stresses of combat and performed maneuvers at the edge of human capability. The Helldivers' contribution to victory came not from revolutionary technology or overwhelming firepower, but from the systematic integration of good engineering, thorough training, and uncompromising tactical doctrine. The 7G dives weren't examples of reckless bravery. They were calculated applications of extreme force necessary to accomplish the mission while maximizing pilot survival rates. That's what made the performance over Cape Engaño remarkable. It wasn't superhuman. It was the result of ordinary men pushed to extraordinary limits by training and necessity, flying aircraft designed to enable exactly those kinds of missions. The fact that it required temporary unconsciousness was simply another factor to be accounted for and managed, like fuel consumption or ammunition expenditure. American dive bomber pilots in 1944 had normalized the abnormal, made routine what should have been impossible. The Japanese pilots who watched those attacks, the survivors who made it back to Japan and lived to see the war's end, understood what they had witnessed. They had faced an opponent whose material advantages were so overwhelming, whose training was so thorough, whose willingness to endure physical stress was so complete, that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome the disparity. The dive bombers over Cape Engaño represented American industrial and training capacity translated into combat power at sea. When the last Helldiver was finally retired from Navy service in 1949, it ended an era in naval aviation. The specialized dive bomber disappeared from carrier air wings, replaced by multi-role attack aircraft that could perform many missions, but none with the precision and dedication of aircraft designed solely to dive on ships. The men who had flown those missions, who had experienced blackouts at low altitude and lived to tell about it, mostly went home and resumed civilian lives. The physical toll remained with many of them, back problems and vision issues that would plague them for decades. But they had accomplished what they were sent to do. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers sank on October 25, 1944. The men who sank them did so by diving nearly vertically through anti-aircraft fire, releasing 1,000-pound bombs at altitudes measured in hundreds of feet, then pulling out with forces that temporarily blinded them. It was terrifying. It was necessary. That's the real story of the Helldivers at Leyte Gulf. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.